I grew up in a house where the rules were different depending on who you were. If you were my brother, rules were suggestions. If you were me, they were walls. My mother ran the family like a stage production she directed. My brother performed, and I was somewhere in the back, moving props, and pretending not to notice the applause was never for me. My father was the quiet one. Not quiet like peace. Quiet like someone who had given up trying to correct the imbalance, and decided to love both of us equally in silence, since speaking up never changed anything. He worked 31 years as a civil engineer. He built bridges, literally, the kind that carry thousands of people every day without anyone thinking about who designed them. That was my father in a sentence: invisible, essential, and never thanked. When I was 12, he taught me how to read a balance sheet at the kitchen table. Just because, he said. Just so you always know where the money is. I thought he was being random. I didn't understand until much later that he was being deliberate. I followed that thread all the way to a degree in accounting, then a certification in forensic accounting, then a job at a firm in Charlotte that handled fraud investigation for mid-size companies and estate disputes. My work was not glamorous. It was not the kind of thing you describe at holiday dinners and get applause for. Numbers. Discrepancies. Paper trails. I found the lies that lived inside spreadsheets. I was very good at it. My brother Marcus followed a different path, which is a polite way of saying he followed no path at all. He was 2 years older, and by 32, he had burned through 3 business ventures, 2 relationships, and 1 very forgiving business partner who finally stopped being forgiving. My mother called him entrepreneurial. My father called him restless. I called him what he was: someone who had never been told no by the 2 people whose job it was to say it. He had charm. I will give him that. The kind of charm that gets you invited to parties and never asked to help clean up. He could walk into a room, make everyone feel special for 30 seconds, and walk out with something that wasn't his. I watched him do it at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday dinner where my mother cut him a larger slice without noticing she'd done it. I lived 40 minutes away. I had my own apartment, my own routines, my own carefully maintained life that asked nothing from anyone. I came home for the important occasions and left before the wine got low enough to make things honest. That was our arrangement. It worked the way most family arrangements work: not well, but steadily. My father got sick in January. Not the slow kind of sick you adjust to, the fast kind. By March, the doctors were using words like aggressive and timeline. And by April, we were sitting in a hospice consultation room being told to think about what he would want. My mother cried in the car on the way home. Marcus put his arm around her and said he would handle everything. I sat in the back seat and stared out the window and understood, in that moment, exactly what handle everything was going to mean. My father passed in early May, on a Tuesday morning, with rain on the window and a nurse who held his hand when the rest of us stepped out to get coffee. I will carry that detail for the rest of my life, that he was not alone, that someone was kind enough to stay. The weeks after were what you would expect. Casseroles from neighbors. Cards in the mailbox. My mother moving through the house in a daze, touching his things without picking them up. Marcus stayed over more, which I thought at the time was out of love. I was wrong about the reason, but right that it was strategic. My father had a will. He had made it carefully, with an attorney, about 4 years before he died. He updated it the year before. I knew because he mentioned it to me once, casually, during a phone call about nothing in particular. Just so you know, he said, I updated it. It's fair. I said okay and changed the subject because we were both uncomfortable talking about it, and neither of us knew how little time was left. The estate was not enormous, but it was solid. The house paid off. A retirement account, a small investment portfolio he had managed carefully for 20 years, and a piece of land in western North Carolina, 40 acres, that had belonged to his father before him. That land meant something beyond money. My grandfather had been buried on the edge of it. My father had scattered wildflower seeds along the creek every spring. It was the only place I ever saw him look fully at ease. 3 weeks after the funeral, I drove home for the estate meeting with the attorney. His name was Gerald Marsh, a soft-spoken man who had handled my father's affairs for over a decade. I arrived 10 minutes early. Marcus and my mother were already there, sitting close together, which should have been comfort but felt like something else. Gerald opened the file. He walked through the will methodically. The house and personal assets to my mother. The investment portfolio split equally between Marcus and me, and the land, the 40 acres in North Carolina, left entirely to me, with a note from my father written in the margin of his personal copy that Gerald read aloud. He wanted her to have it because she's the one who would understand what it meant. My mother's face did not change. Marcus's did, for just a moment. A tightening around the jaw. Something that moved through his eyes too fast for anyone else to catch. I caught it. I cataloged it and said nothing. The meeting ended. We walked out together. In the parking lot, my mother hugged me and said your father loved you so much. And I believed her because it was true. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Let's figure out the logistics soon," and I nodded and drove home. A month passed. Gerald's office sent the paperwork to initiate the title transfer on the land. I signed my copies and mailed them back. Then Gerald called me. He spoke carefully, the way attorneys do when they are telling you something that requires you to sit down first. The paperwork had come back from the county recorder's office. There was a problem. A deed transfer had already been filed 6 weeks earlier before my father's will had even been entered into probate. The land had been transferred out of the estate into an LLC registered in Marcus's name. I asked Gerald to repeat that. He did. I sat very still for a long time after I hung up. My forensic brain was already running the math, mapping the timeline, pulling at the thread. 6 weeks earlier was the week after my father died. The transfer paperwork would have required a signature. A notarized signature. From someone authorized to act on behalf of the estate. My father's signature was on the transfer document. My father had been in hospice care that week. He had not signed anything. He could not have. I drove to my mother's house that evening. I did not call ahead. I brought nothing except the timeline I had already assembled in my head and the specific, targeted calm that takes over when I am working a case and need to stay precise. My mother was in the kitchen. Marcus's car was in the driveway. I sat at the table. I told them what Gerald had told me. I said it plainly, without accusation in my voice, because accusation is emotional, and emotion loses cases. My mother looked at Marcus. That was the first thing she did. Not at me, at him. Marcus leaned back in his chair and made a face that was designed to look bewildered. He said he had no idea what I was talking about. He said maybe the recorder's office made an error. He said these things happen with estates all the time, right? I looked at my mother. She was nodding. I said, "Marcus, Dad was in hospice that week. He didn't sign anything." My mother set her hands flat on the table. "Emma," she said, and she used that tone, the one that means stop making things uncomfortable. Your father loved all of us. He was not himself at the end. Maybe he signed something he didn't fully understand. We don't need to make this into something ugly. I looked at her for a long moment. She was not confused. She was choosing. I drove home. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to understand what came next. I did not decide to fight back out of anger. I did not do it because I wanted to punish my brother or prove my mother wrong. I did it because that land had a note beside it in my father's handwriting. Because he had walked that creek every spring for 30 years. Because he had wanted me to have something that mattered, and someone had taken it by signing his name after he was already gone. That is forgery. That is fraud. And it is the precise language of my profession. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Patricia Nguyen, and she is the kind of lawyer who does not reassure you with empty optimism. She asked me 3 questions, said she would look at the documents, and called me back in 48 hours with a voice that told me she had found what I expected. The signature on the transfer document had discrepancies. The notarization was from a notary who had been disciplined once before for improper certification. The LLC had been registered 11 days after my father entered hospice care before he died, technically, but during a period when his attending physician had documented that he lacked capacity for legal decision-making. Patricia said she could file to invalidate the transfer and pursue fraud charges. She asked if I was ready for that. I said yes. She said, "This will get loud. Your family will not make it quiet." I said, "I know how they operate." She said, "Good. Then, let's be louder on paper." The filing happened on a Thursday. By Friday evening, my mother had called me 4 times. I let it go to voicemail. The messages moved in stages. The first was confused. The second was hurt. The third had Marcus in the background. The fourth was a different kind of quiet, the practiced kind, the one that meant they had made a decision about how to handle this. Marcus called me Saturday morning. His voice was the performance version, warm and slightly wounded. He said he thought we could work this out between ourselves. He said attorneys made everything worse. He said, "Think about what this does to Mom while she's still grieving." I thought about my father signing wildflower seeds along a creek. I said, "Talk to Patricia." He said some other things after that, but I had already set the phone on the counter and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, my neighbor was mowing his lawn. The sound was ordinary and steady, and had nothing to do with any of this. The next few weeks were exactly what Patricia had predicted. My mother called my aunt, who called my cousin, who texted me 3 paragraphs about family loyalty that she had clearly not written herself. A neighbor of my mother's sent me a Facebook message saying that Marcus had explained everything, and it was all a misunderstanding. Marcus himself filed a counter motion through a local attorney, claiming that my father had verbally agreed to transfer the land before he died, and that the paperwork was simply executing his wishes. Verbal agreement on a piece of real estate from a man who was medically documented as lacking capacity. Patricia laughed, not cruelly. She said, "They're not even trying to be careful." I said, "They never had to be before." What followed was a discovery process that I understood better than most people in my situation would, because I have spent years doing exactly this for other people's cases. Patricia subpoenaed the notary's records. The notary, under pressure, admitted that he had not witnessed the signature in person. He said he had been contacted by Marcus, told the situation was urgent and a family matter, and had certified the document without proper verification. He was, to use Patricia's word, cooperative. He understood very well what his own exposure looked like. Patricia also subpoenaed the bank records for the LLC. Marcus had not sold the land, but he had taken out a loan against it, a substantial one. He needed the land not for sentiment, not for any noble reason. He needed it for collateral. He was underwater on a business debt and had found a solution that required my father's name and a notary who looked the other way. When Patricia laid the full picture out in front of me, I felt something I did not expect. Not anger, not triumph, something closer to exhaustion and clarity arriving at the same time. The story was so simple underneath all the paperwork. My brother needed money. My mother let him take it. Neither of them thought I would do anything about it. The hearing was a Tuesday in September. The courthouse in Charlotte was unremarkable low ceilings, fluorescent lights, the particular smell of a building where difficult things are handled every day until they become routine. Patricia walked beside me in a charcoal blazer, her briefcase in one hand, a coffee in the other. She had done this many times. Her calm was professional, practiced, and contagious. My mother and Marcus were already seated at the respondents' table. My mother had dressed carefully, the way she dressed for church pearls, a navy blouse. The image of a grieving widow who only wanted peace. Marcus wore a jacket that didn't quite fit. Their attorney was a man named Howard Webb who had taken the case on a contingency basis, which Patricia told me suggested he expected to settle quickly. He had not read the discovery documents carefully enough. The judge was a woman, late 50s, short silver hair. Expression that suggested she had heard every version of this story before and was waiting to see which variation this one would be. Howard spoke first. He had a practiced cadence, the kind built for sympathy. He talked about my father's wishes, about a family in grief, about the complexity of estate decisions and the way things sometimes happened informally between people who loved each other. He said Marcus and my father had a close relationship, that the transfer reflected a conversation they'd had many times. He used the word healing 3 times. He asked the court to consider the emotional context. The judge listened without expression. Patricia stood. She did not talk about emotion. She talked about documents. She laid out the timeline in 11 sentences, each one referencing a specific exhibit number. She noted the medical record from my father's attending physician documenting lack of capacity dated 6 days before the transfer was filed. She noted the notary's sworn statement admitting he had not witnessed the signature in person. She noted the LLC registration date, the loan agreement, and the business debt Marcus had used the loan to partially cover. She placed each document before the court with the same energy you would use to arrange items, on a shelf, methodical, unhurried, complete. Howard objected twice. Both times the judge overruled him with a single word. My mother, at one point, reached for Marcus's arm. He was looking at the table. Patricia closed by saying that the signature on the transfer document was not my father's voluntary act. It was executed without his knowledge or consent, during a period when he lacked legal capacity, by means of improper notarization. She said the land had sentimental and financial value and had been explicitly designated in the will, and that the transfer had been designed to circumvent a legally binding estate document. She said the court had everything it needed. Then she sat down and wrote something in her notepad, and I could see it was not a legal note. It was a grocery list. That was how comfortable she was. Howard made another attempt. He suggested that perhaps there had been an honest misunderstanding, that Marcus had genuinely believed the transfer was his father's intent, and that surely the court could appreciate the difficulty of the grieving process. He was building toward a settlement offer. The judge looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Counselor, I've reviewed the notary's deposition. I've reviewed the medical documentation. The word misunderstanding doesn't apply here." Marcus's jaw tightened. The judge ordered the land transfer voided and the title returned to the estate for proper distribution per the will. She referred the matter to the district attorney's office for further review of the signature on the transfer document and the conduct of the notary. She also noted that Marcus's attorney had been listed as a creditor in the loan documentation, which she flagged for independent review. Then she looked at the respondent's table, not at Howard, not at Marcus, at my mother. She said, "Ma'am, I understand grief makes people do things they might not otherwise do, but grief does not override a will, and it does not make fraud a family matter." My mother looked like she had been slapped. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. Outside the courtroom, Patricia checked her phone and said the DA's office had already received the referral. Marcus and my mother stood near the parking lot exit. Their attorney was talking to them, and from the way Marcus kept shaking his head, the conversation was not going the way he had expected. My mother started walking toward me. Patricia put one hand up, not aggressive, just present. She said, "There's a no-contact provision pending the DA review. You'll want to stay on that side of it." My mother stopped. She looked at me over Patricia's shoulder. Her face was doing something complicated, cycling through the stages: disbelief, hurt, the beginning of something that might eventually become understanding, though I was not going to wait around for it to arrive. I said nothing. My mother said, "This is not what your father would have wanted." I thought about my father at that kitchen table teaching me to read a balance sheet, just so you always know where the money is. I said, "Actually, I think it is." Patricia and I walked to the parking garage together. She said the DA review would likely result in formal charges against Marcus within 60 days, given the notary's cooperation. She said the land title would clear within a few weeks and would be transferred to me per the will. She said Howard Webb would probably drop Marcus as a client after today, which he did, as it turned out, the following Monday. I asked her if she thought my mother had known from the beginning. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think she knew enough to stay quiet and call it something else." That was the most honest thing anyone said to me that entire year. The drive home was 40 minutes. I listened to the radio without processing any of it. The late afternoon light came through the windshield in long horizontal bars, the kind that makes everything look like a film still. I thought about very ordinary things: whether I had enough coffee at home, whether the dry cleaning was ready, whether the half-dead plant on my balcony had finally given up. I did not think about my brother. I did not think about the look on my mother's face. I thought about the land, about 40 acres of western North Carolina hillside, about a creek where wildflower seeds had been scattered every spring by a man who built bridges and never asked for applause. In my apartment, I hung up my jacket and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I had 3 work emails waiting. I answered all 3. Around 8 o'clock, I got a text from an unknown number that I recognized immediately as Marcus's new phone. It said, "I hope you're happy." I did not reply. I screenshotted it and forwarded it to Patricia, who responded 9 minutes later. "Documented, saved, thank you." Over the following weeks, the process moved the way legal processes do, steadily, without drama, immune to feelings. The DA's office opened a formal investigation into document fraud, The notary accepted a deal in exchange for full cooperation. Marcus was charged 8 weeks after the hearing. 1 count of forgery, 1 count of estate fraud. He hired a new attorney, a real one this time, and entered into plea negotiations that resulted in 18 months probation, a fine, and mandatory repayment of the loan amount plus interest to the estate. My mother did not call me for a long time. When she finally did, it was a Sunday evening in November, and her voice was different. Not the performance voice, something underneath it, smaller and less rehearsed. She said she was sorry. She said she had told herself it was what my father would have wanted because Marcus had asked her to tell herself that, and she had been too tired and too sad to push back. She said she knew it wasn't right, but she didn't know how to stop it once it started. She said she missed my father every single day, and none of this had made that better. I listened to the whole thing. When she finished, I said, "I know, Mom, I believe you." She cried a little. I didn't. Not because I wasn't sad, but because I had already done that part alone, in my own time, without an audience. I told her I needed some space before I could figure out what came next between us. She said she understood. I think she actually did, for once. The title to the land cleared on a Thursday in December. Patricia's office emailed me a scanned copy of the deed, my name on it, clean and legal and properly notarized by someone who had actually looked me in the eye. I took the following Friday off work and drove up to western North Carolina. The roads went narrow and winding for the last 20 minutes, and then there was a gravel turnoff with an old wooden post that my grandfather had put there decades ago, and I pulled over and got out and just stood for a minute in the cold air. The creek was still there. The water was low in December but moving, steady over the rocks. I walked down to the edge and stood where the ground flattened out, where you could see the whole open stretch of land before the tree line. Somewhere in the far corner, under a maple, was where my grandfather was buried. My father had come here every spring. He had stood right here, probably, just looking. I did not cry then either. I just stood there and let it be quiet. On the way home, I stopped for gas and checked my phone. There was an email from a colleague at the firm asking if I could consult on a new estate dispute case. A client in Raleigh, a complicated family situation, possible document irregularities. I replied, "Send me the files." Then I drove the rest of the way home with the radio on. The heat up, the bare winter fields passing on both sides of the road. I thought about my father's note in the margin of his will. She's the one who would understand what it meant. He was right. He was right about almost everything when he let himself speak. I had always been the one in the background, competent, invisible, clearing the table while someone else got the applause. I had spent years being grateful for a quiet life that asked nothing from anyone. But quiet and invisible are not the same thing. I had confused them for a long time. The system does not care about who is louder or who cried more convincingly in a parking lot. It cares about documentation. It cares about timestamps and signatures and the chain of custody on a piece of paper. I had spent my entire career understanding that, and when it finally mattered for something personal, every year of it showed up exactly when it needed to. Marcus's probation would last 18 months. The fraud record would follow him longer than that. My mother was learning, slowly, at 71, that protecting the wrong person is not the same as love. Those were their consequences to carry. I had a piece of land with a creek on it and wildflower seeds I was already planning to scatter in April. That was enough. More than enough. It was exactly what had been intended. Back in my apartment that evening, I made dinner and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had reviewed discovery documents, drafted timelines, mapped out a case the way I would map out any other case, except this one had my name in it. I had not been dramatic. I had not been vindictive. I had done what my father taught me to do, 20 years ago over a balance sheet on a Sunday afternoon. I had followed the money. And at the end of the trail, I found something no one could forge. The truth, verified, documented, and mine.